development of the heart, because it is a vital organ, and the viability of a newborn is totally dependent on the circulation. Initially, the nutrition is provided to the developing embryo by the process of diffusion, and when the three germ layers are formed and the folding is near about, the embryo is not only dependent on the transfer of the nutrition through the diffusion, but it required a proper circulation from the maternal nutrition has to be passed to the newborn embryo. Newly developed embryo. Now, so the heart is the first organ that is functionally activated during the intrauterine life. So it is the first organ that has to become functional during the developmental stages, and it started to develop from the day 18 to 19, and their pumping or the primordial heart functioning started at 21 to 22 days after the fertilization. And the area where the fertilization where the cardiac formation is called as a cardiogenic region. Initially, the heart is present at the upper part of the cranium, but when the folding of the embryo occurred, it reaches in front of the buccopharyngeal membrane, and when there is a septum transversum formed, it will enter into the thoracic cavity. So initially the heart is present in front of the mouth. Okay, so these are the objective. We will discuss about the development of the heart tube. We also discuss about the development, internal structural changes occurred during the development of the atria, interatrial septum, ventricle, interventricular septum, aorta, aortic valve, pulmonary valve, and we also describe the partitioning of the outflow and the incorporation of the neural crest cells in the process of the formation of the partitioning of the great vessels. Okay, so first of all we have to start it with the formation of the vasculogenesis. The when the three germ layers are formed, and the mesoderm is the layer that is responsible for the formation of the connective tissue element, the blood, the circulatory system, the muscles, all that, and the vessels, all they are derived from the mesoderm. So the mesenchymal cells, they accumulate themselves in whole length of the embryo into a form of a clusters, and that clusters are the basically the endothelial progenitor cells. These clusters, they arrange themselves in a form of islands, and these islands, they acquired a lumen, and few of them become blood cells, and few of them, they form a tube like structure, luminal structure, to form the primordial vasculature. So that is called as a vasculogenesis, and from these vessels, these large vessels, the islets that form the vessels, budding of the vascular sprout arises, and that sprouting is termed to be as a angiogenesis. And this whole process started in all part of the embryo during the at the end of the third week, where the three germ layers are definitely formed. Now the formation of the heart tube. Okay, so as I already described you, that the heart is initially, when the three germ layers are formed, the heart is initially formed in front of the primordial head region, and where the brain is formed. But when the folding of the embryo occur, it reaches in front of the buccopharyngeal membrane. Okay, and when then the septum transversum is formed and the further folding occurred, it acquired to the central cavity in the thoracic region, and that is called as a pericardial cavity. So the heart is developed from the splanchnic mesoderm in the cardiogenic area. Initially, that cardiogenic area is present at the head region, and when then the folding occur, it reaches in front of the buccopharyngeal membrane, and when the further folding occurred and the transversum is formed, and it reaches into the pericardial cavity. So approximately at the 18th day of intrauterine or after the after the fertilization occur, the angioblastic cord soon canalize and they form the two endocardial tube, and these endocardial tube coalesce to form a single tube. That is the primordial of the heart. Okay, and it occurs at the begins to beat at the 22nd day of the fertilization. Okay, so the layer of the primitive heart, initially it is comprises of the endothelial tube, which is derived from the mesenchyme, and then the layer is endothelial lining is termed to be as a endocardium. The splanchnic mesoderm that surround the pericardiac coelom, they become to incorporate to formation of the myocardium, and in between these two, myocardium and the endocardium, there is a gelatinous structure present, and that is called as a cardiac jelly, and that jelly is responsible for the formation of the valves and the interventricular septums. So what the sequences occur, I have told you that in the number of the areas of the mesoderm, the islets of the clusters of the vasculogenesis occurred, and they acquired isolated islands of the developing vasculature, and then from these vasculature the angiogenic bud arises and the angiogenesis occur. So in the heart region or the cardiogenic region, approximately in front of the head region, the two tubes, they are the endocardial tubes. These endocardial tubes are formed, and these endocardial tubes, they reaches to approximate to each other, and they get fused, and when the fused, they form a single tube having two end. One is called as a venous end and the other is called as a arterial end. So it has two end. Blood is received and then the blood is out. There is a inflow tract and there is a outflow tract. So there is a venous end and there is a arterial end, and after the fusion, the this single tube has got a number of dilatation, and along with that dilatation, constriction and dilatation, they form a different folding, because the developing heart is now rapidly growing and there is a small area for their accommodation. So it has to be folded on itself in a form of a loop, and that is the U-shaped loop, and further formation of that U-shape, the enlargement of that U-shaped loop in the form of a S loop, and then the this venous end get rotated to the dorsal side, and this arterial end get rotated in front of the heart, of that developing heart. So we will discuss later on these changes in detail. Okay, so the blood flow during the beginning of the when the folding of that occurred, and the arterial and the venous and get identified and they get channelized, they connected with the dorsal aorta, there is a connection develop, because all the vessels are simultaneously formed. ऐसा नहीं होता कि सिर्फ कार्डियोजेनिक एरिया में एंडोकार्डियल वॉल ट्यूब्स बन रही हैं, बाकी बॉडी में नहीं बन रही, बल्कि बाकी पूरी बॉडी में भी वेस्कुलोजेनेसिस हो रही होती है, एंड दीज चैनल्स दे इंटरकनेक्टेड एंड दे फॉर्म अ आर्टीरियल channels and the venous channels. So they interconnected with this developing tubes, and approximately at the beginning of the 4th week, the heart is now started to pump the blood. It receives the blood from the maternal side and then it pumps the blood to the rest of the part of the body to provide the nutrition to the developing embryo, and it could easily be visualized by the Doppler ultrasonography. Okay, so how the blood flow started in the primitive heart. Approximately a unidirectional flow is occurred, and it flows from the sinus venosus. I will describe what are the parts of these tube, endocardial tube. One is called as arterial end and one is called as the venous end. The venous end is the sinus venosus, while the arterial end is the truncus arteriosus. So the venous end receive the blood, and venous end is connected with the atria, primitive atria. It passes the blood from the atria to the ventricle, and from the ventricle it passes to the arterial end, and then it distributed to the through the dorsal aorta into the body of the body yolk sac, and then it carries back the deoxygenated or the waste product to the placenta. Okay, so how the developmental changes occur. I hope all of you will easily visualize the fusion of the endocardial tube. So these fusion of the endocardial tube converted the heart into a single tube having a two end. One is called as a arterial end and the other is called as a venous end. So after the folding, the two tubes approaches to each other to fuse to form a single endocardial tube, and that tube is expanded into, or it acquired a covering of the splanchnic mesodermal layer, and that is called as a pericardial cavity. It occurred into this dilatation occurred into the pericardial cavity. The fusion of these tubes started from the cranial to the caudal end. Okay, so what are the fates of these? One is the venous end, I have told you. So venous end is the sinus venosus. Then the second is the truncus arteriosus. Second, the cranial part is the arterial end, and that connected with the developing pharyngeal arches. They are interconnected with the developing pharyngeal arches, that is called the truncus arteriosus. Then the next to the truncus arteriosus is the bulbus cordis. Then below the bulbus cordis there is a further dilatation called as a primitive or the common ventricle, and below the ventricle there is a atria. So the dilatation and constriction divide this single tube into different region. One is the venous region and other is the arterial end. This venous region is called as a sinus venosus, and that arterial end is called as a truncus arteriosus. So arterial end is connected with a dilated portion called as a bulbus cordis. Then it connected with a common ventricle, and then it connected with the common atria. अब क्या होता है, जब फोल्डिंग होगी तो इसी तरह से जो वेनस पार्ट है वो ओपन अप होगा. It open up into the atria, while atria open up into the common ventricle. So the flow track started from the venous end, reaches to the atria, pushes to the ventricle. From the ventricle it pushes to the arterial end. In the further development, this arterial is divided into the aortic and the pulmonary arteries. Okay. So what happened when the dilatation occurred? The proliferation of the heart tube started, and the site where the proliferation or the enlargement of the tube occur, it is very confined or it is very small. So the tube get folded on itself in a form of a band, and that band is called as a loop, is called as a bulbo-ventricular loop. So the bulbus cordis band on the ventricle, and it goes faster, it goes to be proliferated faster as compared to the rest of the part of the heart. So a loop is formed, and that loop is called as a bulbo-ventricular loop. Okay, and it is so much so proliferated, so it acquired the ventral portion of the developing heart, pushes the arterial and the ventricular end to the dorsal spect. Okay, so initially the tube is dilated, and then it forms a band, that is a bulbo-ventricular loop. This loop is called as a bulbo-ventricular loop. So it protruded out, it grow out, and it pushes the venous end dorsally and medially. It pushes itself into ventrally, and it pushes the venous end into the dorsally. So the arterial end reaches to the ventral aspect of the developing heart, and the venous end is due to the loop or due to the bending of that heart tube, it pushes posteriorly and reaches to the posterior aspect. by the division of the truncus arteriosus into two parts, right and the left, but internally they are interconnected. They are in the single tube. Okay, and these atria and the ventricle are connected with each other by a canal, and that is called the atrioventricular canal. So the ventricular and अब क्या था, ये वही वाला पोर्शन है जो कि बल्बस कॉर्डस का है और वेंट्रिकल का है. ये इनलार्ज होके वेंट्रली आ गए और डॉर्सस एस्पेक्ट पे जो इसका वेनस एंड था ये पोस्ट हो गया अलॉन्ग विद इट्स वेनस वेसल्स. ठीक है, जो वेनस वेसल्स हैं, जो वेनस इनफ्लो है, उसके साथ ये डॉर्सली पुश्ड आउट हो गया. ठीक है, और ये जो आर्टीरियल एंड था ये वेंट्रली आ गया. ठीक है, and there is a connection present between these atria and the ventricle, and that is the atrioventricular canal. So at that time there is a common ventricle and the common atria is present. ठीक है, so as the heart tube more developed its band on itself, so the atrium and the sinus venosus become dorsal to the truncus arteriosus and the bulbus cordis and the ventricles. By this stage the sinus venosus has developed the two lateral expansion or the two horns. अब क्या होगा कि जब ये पीछे चला गया तो sinus venosus developed into two horns, and that two horns are the right and the left horns of the sinus venosus. And what these horns, they receive three vessels from the rest of the three veins from the rest of the part of the body, and these three veins are from the yolk sac, from the placenta, and from the rest of the part of the body. So these three veins are the common cardinal vein, the vitelline vein, and the umbilical vein. These three veins open up into the right and the left part of the sinus venosus. Okay, so each horn receive the veins from the three veins, common cardinal, vitelline and the umbilical. Okay, now internally what happened? हमने बाहर से तो देख लिया कि पार्टीशनिंग, डायलिटेशन हुई, लूप बेंडिंग हुई, वेंट्रिकुलर एंड और जो आउटफ्लो एंड है वो वेंट्रली आ गया, और जो इनफ्लो जो एंड था, जो वेनस एंड था, एट्रिया था, वो डॉर्सली और पोस्टीरियरली चला गया. नाउ व्हाट हैपेंड इंटरनली? Partitioning of the atrioventricular canal and partitioning of the common atrium, partitioning of the common ventricle and the bulbus cordis begins, and it almost they occur simultaneously. अब क्या ऐसा नहीं होता कि one part is follow the other, they occurred usually simultaneously. The partitioning occur atria as well as in the ventricle simultaneously and somewhat overlapping in manner. So initially there is a common chamber in the atria and the common chamber in the ventricle. The endocardial cushion arises into the endothelial part, and that is because of the proliferation of the cardiogenic jelly. They resulted into the formation of the ventral and the dorsal wall of the atrioventricular groove, and these endocardial cushion, they reaches to the approximate to each other to divide this common atria and the common ventricle into right and the left flow. Okay, so they divide the atria and the ventricle into two, right atria and the right ventricle, left atria and the left ventricle. So they causes the partitioning of the partial partitioning of a single chamber into two. Okay, so this is the atrioventricular cushion. These are the endocardial cushion. They appear in the dorsal and the ventral wall of the atrioventricular sulcus, and they approximate to each other, fuses in the midline, divide the two chamber into right flow and the left flow. Okay, still there is a common atria and the common ventricle, but the flow between these two atrioventricle are right and the left because of the fusion of this endocardial cushion occurred. and these provide inductive signal for the partitioning of the atria as well as the ventricle. So the two endocardial cushion arises from the dorsal and the ventral wall of the AV canal. They fuses to divide into a septum that is called the septum intermedium, and that septum intermedium divided the two canal into right and the left canals, and they separate partially the primordial atrium from the primordial ventricle. Okay. Now the partitioning of the common atrium. What arises when the endocardial cushion diffuses down and divide the two canals, right in the left one? A septum arises in the middle of the right, in between the common atrium. Okay, at the middle of the common atrium, a septum arises, and that septum, it encroaches into the front towards the endocardial cushion, and that septum is called as the septum primum. Initially, a septum primum descend down to reaches to the endocardial cushion, and the endocardial cushion again it reaches to approximate towards the edge of the septum primum. So these two edges try to meet into the midline, and it provides the flow from the right to the left side when there is a partial partitioning occurred. Okay, so a hole is persisted in the initially in between the two atrium, and that is called as the ostium primum. So the descending down septum is the septum primum, and the initial partitioning, initial opening in the septum primum is called as the ostium primum. But when this septum primum completely reaches and closes that opening, another opening arises because of the apoptosis in that septum, and that is called as the septum secundum. Why this opening arises? Because during the intrauterine life, the lungs are not functioning, so the left atrium does not receive the blood from the oxygenated blood from the heart, from the lungs. So the blood that enter into the right atrium from the maternal circulation has to passes through the opening into the left ventricle. The atrium pushes to the left ventricle and then distributed to the rest of the part of the circulatory system of the body. Okay, so that is responsible to maintain the flow from the right to the left one. Okay, so what is the septum primum? It is a sickle shaped septum that grows down from the roof of the common atrium, fuses towards the endocardial cushion, and that part is called as the septum intermedium, and it divides the common atrium into right and the left one. Okay, another view that shows the septum primum descend down to move towards the endocardial cushion, and that reaches to form the complete partitioning. But before they fuses down, there is a opening present, and that is called as a foramen primum. But when that opening closes, a few perforation arises in that fused septum, and that is called as a ostium secundum. That is called the ostium secundum. So the ostium primum closes down, and the apoptosis of the septum primum resulted into the formation of the ostium secundum. Another septum in the right atrium medial to that septum primum. अब हमने कहा था कि ये फ्यूज हो गया और सेप्टम सेकेंड प्राइमम के अंदर ऑस्टियम सेकेंडम डेवलप हो गया. जस्ट मीडियल on the right side of that ostium, another septum arises, and that septum is called as the septum secundum. It behaves like a curtain to closes that opening, but does not fuses with the wall. So a channel is communicated from the right to the left, and that channel, that connection or that opening is called as a foramen ovale. Okay, that is the foramen ovale. So the upper portion of the septum that is attached to the roof of the common atrium shows gradually resorption, forming an opening called the ostium secundum. That is the ostium secundum. Another septum descend on the right of that septum. Second primum is called as a septum secundum. Okay. Then it forms an incomplete partitioning between the two atria. Consequently, a valvular foramen is present, a valve-like opening is present between these two atria, is called as a foramen ovale, and in the adult life it represented as a fossa ovalis. Okay, ये वही वाला है जो कि during the intrauterine life होता है, that is called the fossa ovalis. So the fate of the foramen ovale: at birth the circulation started, the pressure begins in the left atrium, it increases and it pushes the edges of the this septum primum to meet with the septum secundum, and this opening closes down and it represented in a form of a fossa ovalis. Now the partitioning of the common ventricle. Simultaneously, when the atria is in the form of a partitioning, the common ventricle is now in the form of a partitioning started of the intermuscular ridge, reaches it projected towards that endocardial cushion. So the primordial division of the primordial ventricle is first indicated by the appearance of the midline muscular septum in the form of a interventricular ridge. This is thickened crescentic fold and concave, and it moves towards this endocardial cushion, and it divides that common ventricle into the right and the left, but still the communication between these two ventricles persisted. So ये वही पिक्चर आ गई जिसमें कॉमन वेंट्रिकल है और ये ट्रंकस आर्टीरियोसिस है, ठीक है, और बल्बस कॉर्डस है. अब ट्रंकस आर्टीरियोसिस और जो बल्बस कॉर्डस है उसने आउटफ्लो ट्रैक बनाया है. ओके, एंड दिस कॉमन वेंट्रिकल इज नाउ डिवाइडेड बिकॉज ऑफ द अपीयरेंस ऑफ द रिज into two by the right and the left by the appearance of a interventricular septal or the interventricular ridge, and still the communication between these two persisted because the opening is persisted until the complete interventricular septum is formed. So interventricular septum developed from different sources, and these sources are the membranous and the muscular sources. So the membranous part of the interventricular septum is divided from the extension of the right side of the endocardial cushion. इस जगह पे endocardial cushion था, इस यहाँ से जब extension हुई, that gives the membranous part, and also there is a aortopulmonary septum. इन दोनों ने मिलके इसका membranous और the outflow part बनाया है. Okay, so the membranous part or the outflow tract of the interventricular septum is smooth, and it is derived from the aortopulmonary septum and from the endocardial cushion. Okay, now this is the brief summary or the brief representation of the partitioning of the common chamber into four: appearance of the endocardial cushion, the passage of the septum primum to reaches to the endocardial cushion, appearance of the ostium primum, then ostium secundum, and the septum secundum, ultimately the formation of the interventricular ridge and division of the common ventricle into two, and the partitioning of the right and the left ventricle, and the partitioning of the right and the left atria. Okay, now what happened with the venous end? The venous end is divided initially into two, into right and the left sinus horn of the sinus venosus, but the right side of the sinus venosus persisted, contributed to form the superior vena cava, while the left one get obliterated and it gives only a small connection, and that is the oblique vein of the left atria and the coronary sinus. So initially the two horns are persisted, but ultimately they disappear to convert it into a coronary vein, coronary sinus, and the oblique vein of the left atrium, while on the right side the veins incorporate to form the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava that receive the blood from the head and neck region and from the rest of the part of the body through the inferior vena cava. So the right hand horns, they incorporate, when they elongated, they incorporate into the primitive atria. So it form the posterior smooth part of the right atrium, while the left horn of they become atrophied and only converted into the coronary sinus. The left common cardinal vein forms the oblique vein of the left atrium. Now what happened into the right atrium? If we take a cut section of the adult heart, we saw that the right atrium into two distinct regions, the smooth part and the trabeculated part. And embryologically, that smooth part is because of the incorporation of the sinus venosus into the atrial wall. So the right horn of the sinus venosus, they incorporate into the posterior wall of the atrium to form the smooth portion of the right atria that could easily be identified into the adult heart, and it is separated from the trabeculated portion or the rough portion by a sulcus that is called as a sulcus terminalis when we visualize on the external side, and if we saw internally, there is a crista terminalis. So smooth and the smooth part is derived from the sinus venosus, while the rough part, trabeculated part, is from the primordium right ventricle atrium. Okay, so the two parts separated by a demarcation that is called the crista terminalis, and externally by the sulcus terminalis. Now what happened with the left atrium? Left atrium basically it derived from the primordial or the primitive atrium. जो हमारे पास common atrium था, basically most of the part of the left atrium is derived from that portion, but it also containing the smooth part. From where this smooth part came? Initially, when the vascular genesis arises, the left atria give a pulmonary vein. Okay, वहाँ से क्या होती है, बर्डिंग निकलती है pulmonary vein. Initially the single vein, then ultimately it has a 2, and then ultimately it has a 4. And because of that appearance of these 4 budding, the increased proliferation becomes into the smooth part. So the smooth part appears because of the budding out of the pulmonary vein from the left atrium. So smooth part of the left atrium is basically derived from the budding of the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary vein. The budding is because of the pulmonary vein. It derived from the common primordium of the atrium, and the smooth part derived from the absorbed pulmonary vein. So the partitioning of the truncus arteriosus. Truncus arteriosus is the cranial part of the bulbous cordis, and that is the arterial end of the arterial outflow tract of the primordial endocardial tube. ये वही एंडोकार्डियल ट्यूब का पोर्शन है जहाँ पर आर्टीरियल एंड था, और ये इंटरकनेक्टेड हुआ था, कैनलाइज हुआ था विद द डॉर्सल एओर्टी. सो इट डिवाइडेड इनटू 2 by the aorticopulmonary septum, and this outflow tract is 180 degree in a spiral shaped, and that because it has to be transmit the blood towards the pulmonary trunk or towards the aorta. तो इसका स्पाइरल होना ज़रूरी था ताकि aorta communicate with the left ventricle and the pulmonary trunk will communicate with the right ventricle. So the spiral ridges arises, and these ridges are the conotruncal ridges or the conotruncal septums, and they bulge out and they rotate into a 180-degree type of spiral proliferation to give a spiral output track from the right ventricle towards the pulmonary trunk and from the left ventricle to the aorta. A spiral septum develop in the truncus arteriosus, divided into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So now the pulmonary artery joins the right ventricle while the aorta joins the left ventricle. This picture may shows a clear demarcation between the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and that twisting of the developing septum occurs. So the aorta goes down posterior medially, and this pulmonary trunk goes down from ventrodorsally into the downward to the upward. इसी तरह से यहाँ पार्टिशनिंग हुई तो पल्मोनरी ट्रंक ये चली गई, एओर्टा ऐसे चला गया. Now what happened with the bulbous cordis? Bulbous cordis form the smooth part of the two ventricles. In the right ventricle, it forms the conus arteriosus or the infundibulum part, which lead to the pulmonary trunk, and in the left ventricle it forms the aortic vestibule, which lead to the aorta. Now initially the sinus venosus are responsible for the generation of the impulse formation, and when they incorporate into the right atrium, a node is identified into the right atrium that is called as a sinoatrial node. So it begins to started conduction at approximately the 5th week in the right wall of the sinus venosus. This sinoatrial nodes incorporated into the wall of the right atrium, and then it becomes the permanent site of that becomes with the entry of the superior, nearer to entry of the superior vena cava. Then the formation of the pulmonary and aortic valves. In this when the partitioning of these vessels occur, अब क्या हुआ, pulmonary trunk और aorta जो है वो separate out हो गए. Now when the partitioning of these trunk occurred, the ridges appear within their valve, and these ridges they shows a sinuses in between them to give a cusp like arrangement. So the triangular valves are formed in between these three ridges. So the transverse section of this bulbous cordis, these bulbar ridges fuses and formation of the walls and the valves in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And from in the aorta, from these sinuses, from these ridges, the aorta and the right and the left coronary sinuses arises. Okay. So brainstorming exercise, you may give the answer. Heart is developed from the or derived from the embryo. Cardinal venous vessels drain into the sinus venosus are through common cardinal vein. Okay. Closure of the foramen primum result from the fusion of the foramen primum, not the foramen secundum, foramen primum. Okay, you may give the answer. Left fetal atrium is mainly derived from the, it has two part, smooth part and the rough part. So main of atrium is mainly derived from the, you must know that. So a summary, a cardiogenic cords that appears into the head region, then move towards the in front of the buccopharyngeal membrane, and these endocardial tube fuses to form a single tube and give the dilatation to the truncus arteriosus, bulbous cordis, palmative ventricle, palmative atrium and the sinus venosus approximately at day 22. Then the loop shape, S shape heart is formed, and it is started to ebb and the flow like beating approximately from 23 to the 28th day. Then the internal separation of the endocardial areas develop because of the appearance of the endocardial ocean, divides the common atria and the common ventricle into two, and then ultimately the common atria into right and the left atria and the common ventricle into the right and the left, and give the outflow tract of these ventricle by the partitioning of the bulbous truncus arteriosus into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Again the summary: fusion of the two areas in the head region, initially these two are formed, then the turning of the or the folding occurs, these two tubes they comes closer from the cranial to the caudal end, they fuses down and they give that show the dilatation and the construction. Have arterial end and the venous end. Arterial end with the they are attached with the fixed with the because of the presence of the pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal arteries, and they are the form the truncus arteriosus, and the venous end they called the right and the left horn of the sinus venosus, then the primitive atria, then the primitive ventricle, bulbous cortex, then the bulboventricular loop is formed because of the increased proliferation. This part becomes protruded out into the ventral aspect and move the venous end dorsally and divide the venous end into two, right and the left horn, but they are interconnected common atrium. Then in this atrium again divided by the appearance of the partitioning of the septum primum and the septum ostium primum, then the ostium secundum develop and the septum secundum develop to give the outflow tract of the blood from the right atrium to the left ventricle, and then the ventricular septal ridges arises. They resulted into the partitioning of the common ventricle into the right and the left ventricle, and the development of the proliferation of the myocardium into ridges, and they give the ventricular musculus pectinity and the trabeculae carne. Okay, so I hope you understand a very simple description of the this lecture.